Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Dharna Noor, joining you from Baltimore. The U.S. Senate voted on Tuesday to accept the nomination of Betsy Devos as Secretary of Education. Vice President Mike Pence had to cast a historic tie-breaking vote because two Republican senators voted against Devos. Devos has turned out to be a particularly controversial nomination. She's been criticized for her demonstrated ignorance of public education policy and for being an all-out advocate for public school privatization measures. Late Monday night, Democrats tried to stop the nomination by holding an overnight session in which they presented their arguments against DeVos. Let's take a look.
Sometimes the most vulnerable of child needs a little help, not just from a loving teacher or a loving parent, but that there is a government that stands behind her and says, you matter.
This is a big and important job. Can you support and be a champion for public education? That seems fundamental. Do you believe in equal accountability for everybody that gets federal dollars? That seems fundamental. Do you believe that kids with disabilities should be able to get this kind of education? That seems fundamental. And in those areas, Ms. DeVos did not succeed.
Joining us to discuss the DeVos appointment is Karen Dolan. Karen is a fellow and poverty expert at the Institute for Policy Studies. She's also the lead author of the IPS report, The Poor Get Prison, and co-author of the IPS report, Mothers at the Gate, How a Powerful Family Movement is Transforming the Juvenile Justice System. Thanks so much for joining me today, Karen.
Thank you so much for having me, Darna.
So as I mentioned, Democratic senators tried fairly hard to stop the nomination by holding this all-night session. But just how different were the Obama administration's educational policies from those that DeVos is advocating? That is, under Obama's Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, charter schools were expanded as well. And Duncan's not alone. Many Democrats have actually been in favor of school privatization. We just heard opposition to Betsy DeVos from Cory Booker, who is a member of the pro-privatization group Democrats for Education Reform. So in light of all this, talk about what could change under DeVos and what's at risk.
Well, it's true that Democrats also support some privatization of education processes and charter schools. And there are some charter schools in some areas of the country that have more accountability than others. Unfortunately, in Michigan and in Florida, where Betsy DeVos was most active, those are not such places. Charter schools there were a complete disaster, lacked accountability, and children did less, performed less well in those charter schools that Betsy DeVos funded than the poor performing public schools that they were supposedly created to counteract. And just generally, charter schools, however well constructed and with whatever kind of oversight or accountability they propose to have, they do funnel much needed public funds, taxpayer money, out of public schools, and especially in areas where that's needed the most. And Betsy DeVos, as we know from her nomination hearings and from a lot of the protests and discussions and news about her, was not a proponent of public education, has never been involved in public education, has never had her children in public education, and probably, I would guess, has never even stepped inside of a public school building. This is a terrible harbinger for what is facing our children in a free democratic society where one of the cornerstones of such a democratic society is free public education. Now, the difference with what we may see under a DeVos education department, I shudder to even say the words, it sounds like an oxymoron, is a defunding of the public school system, a lack of accountability, diverting public monies towards private education, towards parochial schools. She was unable to commit to equal accountability. She was unaware of protections for children with disabilities. Her money, and money of her family has contributed to right-wing Christian organizations that are anti-LGBTQ. So this is in stark contrast to the Obama Department of Education. Under Arne Duncan, for instance, and the Office of Civil Rights with Catherine Lohman, there was a great deal of attention paid to over-disciplining. There was a great deal of attention paid to anti-discrimination. Under Obama and Arne Duncan, they passed the historic directive to issue protections for gender identity under Title IX. There was a concerted effort and an effort that was successful in beginning to bring down the skyrocketing levels of suspensions and expulsions. There was a multitude of efforts aimed at helping low-income children, African American children, poor children, children that were immigrants and Latino children, disabled children, and protecting LGBTQ children. So there were plenty of problems, and the racial gap still persists in punishment, but a lot of progress was being made. And I am quite sure that under this new department, not only will those gains be rolled back, but the problems will be greatly exacerbated. That is my fear.
And just how much influence does the Secretary of Education wield with regard to public schools? What might we expect her to be able to do without additional congressional authorization?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, it's not just a question of congressional authorization, and because the GOP does hold both chambers of Congress, and they are very pro-privatization and so-called school choice. School choice is nothing but a euphemism for school privatization. She can rely on their support for a lot of those plans that she has. However, the local school districts and states have a lot of control over how their school districts are run, and many states can retain the protections that they have for students. But in particular, the Title IX provision that Obama directed that gender identity be protected under Title IX, that's in legal limbo already. So that is something of particular concern, especially to LGBTQ activists and really to anybody who believes in the human rights of children, that will not expand. So there are some states and some school districts that have chosen to abide by that directive, and once they've given that, it's hard to roll it back. But for all those many that didn't and that indeed protested it, that's not going to get expanded.
One of the issues that you focused on in your work is the relationship between public schooling and the prison system, the so-called school-to-prison pipeline. So first, could you just explain to our viewers a bit about what you mean when you use this term?
Well, the school-to-prison pipeline is a term that's meant to indicate the ways in which, literally, from the time a child walks out of their door into a preschool, if they are poor, if they are Black, if they are Latino, and if they are disabled and later identified as LGBTQ, their chances of being disciplined, suspended, expelled are between 4 and 6 times that of their white peers for the same behavioral offenses. So we're even talking about preschoolers who don't have the right shoes or who scribble on a desk. Even those infractions at the high school level, it can be wearing distracting jewelry. And what we see is that children who are Black, brown, LGBTQ, and disabled are greatly targeted and over-punished, over-disciplined in school systems to the extent of very harsh suspensions and expulsions, which in turn, we also know, increases the chances of not finishing school and or having contact with the juvenile justice system. So that almost ensures reoffending. If children have contact with the juvenile justice system while they're still youth, their chances of reoffending are very, very high, up to 70% higher. So it's a talked about as a pipeline because almost as soon as a child enters the school building, even as a preschooler, their chances are increased that they'll have contact with the criminal justice system.
And how will the policies that we expect from DeVos and the Republicans more generally impact the school-to-prison pipeline? How will the school-to-prison pipeline be affected by what's to come from this administration?
Right, so in addition to what I spoke about in terms of the protections and the anti-discrimination protections and the efforts to support children that are Black and brown and disabled and LGBTQ that have been underway in the previous administration. In addition to those going away, as we see more and more children pushed into a charter school system, we're going to see an exacerbation of the disciplinary action. Children in charter schools, Black, brown, Latino, LGBTQ, and children with disabilities in charter schools are over-disciplined at rates even significantly higher than they are in public schools. So we like to call that, or we're beginning to call that, the charter school to prison pipeline. So I think that that's what we're going to see now also, and the risks for children are far greater even under a system of charter schools which have a history of even greater discipline.
What needs to happen in order to break the school to prison pipeline? What kinds of policies ought to be put in place with regard to public education?
Well, there's several things. One is to get cops out of school, to get the so-called SROs, the security resource officers, out of schools, the special resource officers out of schools. That is no way to handle children or disorderly conduct or talking back to the teacher or using a cell phone in class. There should be much greater attention paid to the social and emotional development of children. We have an increasingly traumatized student population, and what we need is more attention to the traumatized environments in which many children now live, in which the majority of school children now live. And there was an effort to go forward with programs that would pay attention to trauma for children and their social emotional development. It remains to be seen if those programs will stay in place. The ESSA, the Educational Student Act, that was supposed to pay attention to some of these things, that was a bipartisan effort, is still an act that is on the books. We'll see if that keeps going forward. We need to get the cops out of schools, and we need to invest in our public school system. The charter school system doesn't have these protections in place, and the charter school system doesn't have the same kind of accountability, and the push-out rates are very, very high. So we've got to move away from charter schools, not toward them, and we've got to treat children in the public schools in a way that really supports their social and emotional development.
Karen, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to talk to you again soon as the fight for public education continues.
Thank you so much, Darna.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.